the second part of your review from your elementary past. And if you did not have this stuff, this is a good time to look up maybe something that sounds completely foreign to you. But all this information is stuff you should have had in grade school. So I'm going to go very quickly through this part of the art of history. But we're going to look at the growing pains of our nation between the presidencies of VanBuren to the presidency of James Buchanan. We're talking about presidents 8 through 15 in the years 1837 through 1860. This time period is the time period when we are in the second political party system, excuse me. So your two major political parties are going to be the Whigs and the Democrats. And the Democrats are basically going to dominate this time period, but the Whigs will get some presidents. And the ironic thing about the Whigs is they never have a president go a full term. And we'll talk about that later. But America is changing. When our country was first founded, the western border of the United States was the Ohio River. You guys go to Point Park and look across at the Ohio River. The other side of the river was not the United States on July 4th, 1776. By 1837, we have territory that goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean with the Oregon Territory. So our country is growing very quickly. And how we handle that growth is one of the major themes of this period. What are we going to do? All right, your presidents, they're listed there. If it says D, that's a Democrat. If it's a W, it's a Whig. Again, this is the second political party system period. And look at your Whig presidents. William Henry Harrison, he dies. He's replaced by his vice president, John Tyler, who finishes out the term. And then look again at Zachary Taylor. He serves for about 16 months. Then he dies. And then he's replaced by Millard Fillmore, who fills the gap for the rest of that term. The Democrats will serve the time periods in between. So if you just look at W's and D's, it looks like, well, the Whigs and Democrats have the same number of presidents during this time period. But if you look at the years, the Democrats are definitely dominating the period politically. Major themes that you're going to have during this time period. You're going to have sectionalism, North, South, and West. You're going to have slavery be a major issue. Should we have it? Should we not? I mean, in this time period, it's obvious we should not, but to them, it was not as obvious, and it was a major issue. Expansion is going to be a major theme. Manifest destiny, or the belief that God has called us as Americans to dominate the continent. Expansionist wars like with the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution and the out in California as well. The gold rush and the 49ers. And every time we expand and make new states, you'll notice that we do it in pairs. One state will become a state with another state. And one state's a slave state, one state's a free state. That's a major theme. Secession mindset entrenching. So, no state formally seceded from the Union during this time period, but the mindset that they did exist. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at reform movements. You're going to have religious reform movements like the Mormons who move out west, and the end of the Second Great Awakening. And you're going to have the temperance movement. And temperance means to make alcohol illegal. There's a big push to make alcohol illegal. And education movements with Horace Mann and public education for all, and women's rights with the Seneca Falls Convention. And the big one's going to be abolitionism, the belief that slavery was not only wrong, but it was morally wrong to God as well. And then railroads. Railroads are going to be the generational thing, much like honestly, computing has been the generational thing for my generation, where before people just traveled by foot or by horse, and by the end of this period, people are traveling great distances. And we are communicating across great distances very quickly in today's generation. So I make a little analogy there. So let's go just jump right into it, because I'm trying to get this done as quickly as possible for you guys. But there are three major sections of the United States during the antebellum period. The antebellum period is this period, 1837 to 1860. Antebellum literally means before the war. And the war is going to be the Civil War. In the North, you're going to have factories begin to develop, and they're going to focus on industry and trade. And the big industry in the North is going to be textiles. Textiles are the making of cloth, and they're going to introduce an hourly wage system. Now, today, getting paid by the hour is normal, but this was new to this time period, and the Industrial Revolution, or the making of things with machines, really makes this happen. Before then, everything was product-based pay. You make a product or you produce a service, and then you get paid for it. But now you're getting paid for your time of work. That is a new concept in this time period. In the South, you have the cash crop system. They're growing cash crops like tobacco and indigo, but the big one is cotton. And it's based on slave labor, where basically the slave owners, quote unquote, take care of their slaves, which they didn't take care of them very well, but that's what they said they were doing in exchange for their labor. This was a step below the feudal system that existed in Europe in the 1500s, 1400s, and before. And a lot of the plantation owners viewed themselves almost like lords of their manor. Their plantation was their manor. And in the West, you're going to have yeoman farmers. Yeoman means they're growing crops for their family, and they're growing crops for their own personal gain, but they're relying on their own personal labor, and they expect to be paid for their work, and they get paid not by the hour, but by what they produce. So these three systems, economic systems, are vastly different in the same country, and yet they're reliant upon the other two systems. For example, if you're going to move west, Levi Strauss and denim. Denim is made from cotton. So the raw cotton came from the South, and the product of denim came from the northern factories to produce this needed wear. So that's just one quick example. Slavery is a second theme. Southerners are going to defend it as their peculiar institution. And I know I don't say peculiar very well. It's a word I do struggle saying with, and I apologize in advance. But they're going to say it's the peculiar institution. Slavery by this time period had been abolished in the North. It was never allowed in the Northwest Territory. But one thing that made slavery grow by leaps and bounds was the cotton gin. We talked about that in the last lesson. And more slaves were needed for quote-unquote king cotton. And it dominated the economies of the South, especially the western South, like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas. Slavery became an economic, quote-unquote, necessity. That's not my saying that. That's the slave owners from that time period saying that. During that time period, they became dependent on cheap labor. Also, free blacks, the concept of a free black became less and less free. The rights of African Americans, even who were not slaves, were taken away. You had separate rail cars in the North, not in the South, in the North on rail lines. Okay, you had the Fugitive Slave Act. which stated that if somebody was a former slave and they were in the North now and they were a quote-unquote free man, they could be recaptured and taken back to the South. And by the way, they could also, an African American could not prove their citizenship. So if you had a slave trader just come and say, he belongs to so-and-so, they had no rights. They literally had no rights. You had the Dred Scott decision, probably one of the 5 worst decisions in U.S. history, where Dred Scott went to a free territory with his master, and in that free territory, he was there, and then his master wanted to go back home with him, and he didn't want to go. Long story short, he was forced to be a slave because, quote-unquote, slaves did not have rights. And you're also going to see this kind of argument in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and it was a horrible decision. But that was the decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court at that time period. The Southern way focused on large plantation owners being at the top of the social order, with professionals like doctors and lawyers and teachers, but the teachers were women. That's important to point out. Most of the teachers were women, but they could only be unmarried women because it was thought that a married woman had to focus on her own family and her own children. Poor landless whites would be towards the bottom. In between the landless whites and the professionals, you have the small rural farmers who basically have a little bit of land and they're growing enough food to feed their family. The landless whites were called dirt eaters. They were called a couple other names that were worse than dirt eater, but that's the one I'll throw out there as an example. And at the bottom of the social order were African American slaves, and they were treated less than human in this situation. Expansion is going to be a major theme. You're going to have expansion wars. You're going to have the California Gold Rush. You're going to have compromise expansion, where every free state that enters the Union, you have to have a slave state. And this is all tied into this belief that God had called the American people to dominate and conquer the North American continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And this belief that Americans held, right, wrong, or indifferent, Americans believed in this. This was called manifest destiny. So let's look at each of those 4 things individually. First, manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was first penned officially in 1845 by a man named John L. O'Sullivan. Now, a lot of people had penned his concept, but not that exact verbiage. But in 1845, in the New York Morning News, John L. O'Sullivan writes, "Our manifest destiny to overspread the continent which Providence has given us." And basically the rest of the passage, which is really wordy, means that God has called us to dominate the continent. It's our destiny. It's our manifest destiny. It's our destiny from God. That's John L. O'Sullivan's verbiage and wordage. And this concept is going to be a major concept of the Americas the rest of the 19th century. We are going to continue to move westward and make new states. This is going to inspire this particular painting, which I use as your first half of the year painting, America Progress by John Gast. And if you look at the right side of the painting, it's in the light. Well, that's in the east. And you look at all these things that are bringing progress to the west, like the railroad and the telegraph, and and it's Lady Progress, who is bringing liberty, who is spreading Americanism across the continent. And what do you see on the left, where it hasn't been settled yet? You see darkness, and you see a lot of things that the American people at this time period viewed as uncivilized. And this is hard to talk about, but it was their view that they had to spread light across the American continent. Of course, to do that, you have to wipe out people, and that's a part of history we don't like to talk about, but it did happen. It happened to the Native Americans, where we had our Native American wars. We'll talk about that on another day. But I want to focus in on the expansionist wars with Mexico, namely Texas to the south and California and Oregon to the west. Texas broke away from Mexico and became an independent country in 1836. And they applied to become part of the United States. And for about 10 years, the United States was a little iffy about accepting them. But by 1846, Texas gets annexed and becomes an official state of the United States. There's just one little, small, huge problem: the southern border. Namely, where is it? The Republic of Texas argued that the southern border was the Rio Grande River. The country of Mexico said no, it's the Natchez River, so to speak. I know I just butchered the pronunciation, forgive me on that, but a river to the north of the Rio Grande. And the two sides, you had disputed territory between them. The United States, after annexing Texas, intentionally put troops on the northern border, on the northern side of the Rio Grande River, which Mexico also claimed. And then when Mexico attacked those American troops, the United States said, hey, wait a minute, we were attacked by an outside aggressor. Mexico said, you're on our property. We said, no, you're not, we are not. And that went to the U.S. Congress. Congress declares war on Mexico, and that war is known as the Mexican-American War. The result of that war is it establishes the southern border of Texas to be the Rio Grande River, which it is today. That is the southern border of the United States and Texas. That was clarified with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now out west, you have two situations. You have the Bear Flag Revolt in 1848. For a very short time, California was an independent republic as well, and it gets annexed by the United States much quicker than Texas did. This revolt is infamously known as the Bear Flag Revolt. If you go to California today and look at the state flag of California, you're going to see a black bear on the flag. That's because that goes all the way back to the Black Bear or the Bear Flag Revolt. University of California, they're the Golden Bears. So Oregon. Now the Oregon Territory was claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. Remember, we had already fought 2 wars with them. And by the time the 1840s rolled around, Britain, they wanted land there because, you know, it's connected to Canada. They really didn't want all the Oregon Territory. In the United States, you had people who were moving to Oregon Territory already, and they wanted all of Oregon. But most of the people back east didn't want to have to fight a war for all of Oregon Territory. And so you had the saying out west, 54-40 or fight. 54-40 is the northern parallel, which basically would have touched modern day Alaska's southern peninsula, panhandle. But in a diplomatic arrangement, the United States and Britain agreed to keep the 48th parallel as the boundary between the United States and Britain all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This prevented a war that really, frankly, neither side wanted to fight, and Today, the boundary is still there. The northern part of Oregon Territory became the Canadian province of British Columbia. In 1849, gold is actually late 1848, gold is discovered. And by the time word gets back east and people are actually able to move from back east to out west, it's 1849. And the gold rush, you have people just suddenly showing up in California expecting to just pick up gold off the ground and stuff like that. Well, it wasn't quite like that. There wasn't just gold to pick up off the ground for hundreds of thousands of people. But the great population rush allowed California to go from a sparsely populated area to becoming a state rather quickly. In 1850, California becomes a state. Now, today we think of California as part of the contiguous 48 states. In this time period, California is not attached to the other states. So in a very real way, you could think of California in this time period like we think of Hawaii and Alaska today. They're part of the United States, but they're not connected to the rest of us. But people are moving out there quickly. In 1846, the population of San Francisco was only 200 people. That's it, population. I mean, San Francisco was basically like Boaz. Here, you guys know where Boaz is. Boaz is just, or Belleville. I mean, it was basically a big nothing. But by 1850, just 4 years later, its population was 46,000. That's the population of like Huntington. That's a very big change. And that happened in 4 years, and that population growth continued to grow exponentially because of that. The rare few who found veins of gold to mine got rich, and the suppliers definitely got rich because they're selling the supplies to all these people just hungry to look for gold. But most people didn't. Most people, especially the panners, the vision of California gold panners finding gold and finding specks of gold. Well, specks of gold aren't going to get you rich. Okay? They're going to get you by, but they're not going to get you rich. And compromise expansion. That's another theme. Each state admitted had to have a state admitted with it. If it was a free state, they had to have a slave state. And if it was a slave state, they had to have a free state. So Mississippi, Indiana joins the Union. Alabama, Illinois joins the Union. Maine, well, Missouri joins the Union as a slave state. Arkansas, Michigan joins the Union. Iowa is a free state. Well, Florida joins as a slave state. Texas wants to join the Union. Wisconsin joins as a free state. And this was to keep a balance in Congress so that compromise could work at the federal level. All kinds of things were put in place. You had the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which said that all states that were south of the Missouri Compromise, the southern border of Missouri, the southern border of Missouri were going to become slave, and all the territory north of that would become free. But then we change our mind. For example, later on, when Kansas and Nebraska want to become states, the concept changes to popular sovereignty. Well, let's just let the people in the territory vote. Let them decide. Of course, the slaves weren't asked what they thought. I mean, they don't get the vote. It's only the white men. And that is going to create its own set of problems later on, popular sovereignty. All right, secession mindset is starting to build. Even just before this time period when Andrew Jackson was president, South Carolina mildly threatened to secede the Union in 1833 over tariffs. They didn't like the protective tariffs against British imports into South Carolina. and they were going to nullify the tariffs into South Carolina ports. In other words, they weren't going to collect them. They weren't going to allow them to be collected. And they said, hey, if you collect these taxes in South Carolina, we're going to break away from the Union. Well, a compromise was eventually worked out between John C. Calhoun and the state of South Carolina to make this work. But, you know, the mindset was there. The mindset was there. And even though peacefully it went away in 1833, the attitude did not. And all it takes is another spark. Kansas, we already mentioned Nebraska-Kansas territory. Kansas was the first territory to have popular sovereignty determine if it was going to be a free or slave state. And you have basically two territory capitals, let's get it right, two territory capitals, and Lawrence is the quote-unquote free capital, and they're going to get sacked by pro-slave forces and burned to the ground. Now, this is going to cause John Brown to do later on the massacre at Potomac Creek. You have the Brooks-Sumner affair, where literally you're going to have one U.S. senator get beaten by a cane by another U.S. senator. That happened just before the Civil War. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates, even though this was in the North, in Illinois, one of Douglas's arguments was, well, people should just choose if slavery is going to exist there or not in each place so that we can keep the southern states appeased. Well, what's the big deal about the southern states being appeased? Well, because the undertone there is they're going to break away. All right. Of course, you're going to have slave revolts, and you're going to have John Brown in Bleeding, Kansas, and Harper's Ferry as well. So, you know, this is all going to boil into the secession mindset. You're going to have reform movements, and they are big during the antebellum period. It's important to understand that. You had religious movements like the Second Great Awakening, which was ending in the 1840s, but it was still very strong in the 1840s. You're going to have the Mormonist movement. You're going to have movements where, camp meetings. And even though this is a religious issue, in this particular situation, you can't completely separate the religious beliefs that Americans had in the Midwest from what was going on. And one of the big things about the religious movement was, that was going on was all people could be saved. Now, whether you believe in Christ or not, or God or not, that's not the point. The belief that everybody needed to hear the gospel meant that everybody was equal in the eyes of God, including African American slaves. Ding, ding. And so this is going to lead to the abolitionist movement, where people are actively saying, hey, it is wrong to have slaves. They're going to point to the book of Exodus, where the Jewish people were slaves under Pharaoh of Egypt, and the 10 plagues and that whole story. That's all going to come into play, and it's going to be a major theme in the background just before the American Civil War. Education is a big piece of that. Horace Mann is going to be one of the pushers of compulsory education for all. You're going to have the temperance movement, which is also right there along with women's rights. Now, today, it's hard to envision this, but, you're talking about a time period when women had no political rights and no say, and they could legally be beaten by their husbands. And a husband that beat his wife, he was usually drinking. So today it doesn't make sense. Well, why is the temperance movement and women's rights movement together? Because a lot of the men who were abusive to their wives happened to be drunk. And so you have these things all coalescing together during this time period just before the American Civil War. You have a large sector of the population calling for a great social change, a change to the social order and the way we do things. You have famous abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who's the editor of the Liberator, in Boston, Massachusetts. You have Henry Ward Beecher, who was a preacher who was very, very anti-slavery and pronounced slavery and slave owners as anti-God. You had Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who became a free black, who was giving speeches across the North, and he's also supporting women's rights as well. For example, at the Seneca Falls Convention, which is like the first big major meeting of women to call for the right for women to vote, Frederick Douglass is there speaking on behalf of women to get the right to vote. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman are former slaves who are calling for the rights of their brothers and sisters enslaved in the South. And of course, we already talked about Elijah Lovejoy and what happened to him in Alton with his murder. Another major theme are the railroads. Again, I mean, railroads are just booming across the North. By 1850, you have 5,000 miles of railroad in the North. Now, the South has railroads, but they're not connected. They're all just local networks. Like you might have some railroads around Charleston, South Carolina, and I have some around some other ports, but they're not going across the country, or at least they're not going out to what we would call today the Midwest. They're not going out there. They're staying around urban pockets. Meanwhile, the railroads of the North are stretching into the resource lands of the West. You're beginning to have the Great Lakes connected to the North, and that's a big, big difference. In 1854, the Transcontinental Railroad begins to be built. Now, it's not completed until after the American Civil War, but it's beginning, and it begins to feed into the imagination of Americans. Hey, we can really go across this continent. So it's connected to that manifest destiny concept. By 1860, this is what the United States looks like. Very different than the map that you saw in 1776. We have territory connecting the east to the west along the Pacific Ocean. We have continuous territory. That's a big, big part of that. Yes, California is the state off by itself, but we are being able to visualize, for example, Oregon becoming a state very soon. We're able to visualize this middle territory between Missouri and Texas and Iowa and California eventually being filled in with American states. It's there. It's before us. And how we deal with the change of a vastly fast-growing America into a vastly fast-paced 19th century, at the same time holding on to the ideals that our country was built upon, and also what ideals do we hold on to? Do we really believe all people are created equal? Down in the South, they didn't believe that meant African American slaves. And even in the North, there was a lot of racism in the North. Even though they were anti-slave, they didn't want the African Americans living in the same neighborhood as them, as an example. All right, so that's just a quick overview of this time period. I hope it sparked some memory of what you should have learned in grade school. And you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you.